Well, thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you again for joining us at our special Coffee and Quality on this Wednesday afternoon. If we have not met before, I'm Jessica Davison. I'm the Senior Director of Mission and Strategy here at United Way of Greater Houston. I'm very excited to be with you in this afternoon in this space for the case study with Wesley Community Center and Kinder Institute for Urban Research. So if you are new to Coffee and Quality, welcome. And if you are returning, welcome back. So glad to see you. So glad to have you in this space. Again, thank you so much for spending this afternoon with us. We are going to hear about the case study experience with Wesley, their findings, the takeaways, and then how can nonprofits use this information for their own work, for what they're doing, that transferable knowledge. That's what we're really hoping to get from today. And so thank you all again for joining, especially for spending this hour with us. We know there's a lot going on in the world today, and so glad that we can shine the light on Wesley Community Center today. As I mentioned, if you are new to Coffee and Quality, we have a couple of ground rules. We really want to make this space welcoming and inviting to everyone. We know everybody comes to this with different perspective, different use of data and evaluation, and we really want to make sure that this is a great space for you to learn and get some takeaways that you can apply back into your work. And so Coffee and Quality, always and forever, will be a safe space for you to share and learn. Please come in with an open mind and open heart. We want you to take in what you can and bring it back into your work. Please participate by sharing your knowledge and experience. And as always, it's an invitation, not an obligation to share. And so today we're going to hear more about the case study experience with Wesley. But before that, two little commercials. The first one is if you are not engaged in United Way's Coffee and Quality Teams channel, please drop your email in the chat and we will make sure you get added into that Teams channel. That is a great space to stay engaged between these virtual sessions, to hear about different resources, see about different opportunities in the community, all related to data evaluation and continuous quality improvement. So if you're not already there, it's welcome for all. So please put your email in the chat. The other one is, if you didn't know already, we have a little thing called the 2025 Data Practices Survey going on right now. We want to hear from you, and we want to hear from other people that are at your work, that are engaged with data evaluation. We really want to know what that looks like for the individual as well as the organization. And so hopefully somebody from Kinder Institute can do me a solid and put the link to that survey in the chat. I would be forever grateful. But you can also scan it as a QR code. You could scan it as the QR code and you could take that and do it after this session's over, or do it right now because I know some folks are multitasking. But if you would do that, we'll really want to hear from you. This is just better, helps us understand what's the landscape happening for nonprofits with their data and evaluation. And so it closes on February 13th. This is not the last time you will hear about this survey. And so please, if you haven't already, please take the survey. Thank you. All right. So with that, those were my two commercials. I want to thank you all again for joining us for Coffee and Quality and this special case study. And so if you're new to the case study, I want to share a little bit about it. The case study is an opportunity for one nonprofit to work with and partner with United Way of Greater Houston and Kinder Institute for Urban Research. And so what the case study does is it brings an organization, brings it to this partnership experience where we get to use their data to then help them answer a question that they can't necessarily answer on their own, because you have this coupling of United Way that's going to help think through the process, help really dig on some of the questions and data that they have, and then the analytical chops, know-how of all things of Kinder Institute to help answer those questions. And so through that experience, we really get to dive into some deeper insights that the organization might not be able to capture on their own. And so this is our third case study. Our first two, we had Angel Reach and Alexander JFS. And so they were so gracious and to experience this case study with us to not only improve and better understand their work and answer questions they had, but then also shine a light to other nonprofits on how they can use this information, how this can apply to the work that they're doing. And so as a part of the case study experience, it's 6 months where we're, going back and forth with data and conversations. At the end of the case study experience, they have what you are all joining in now today for, this presentation to share out about the process, the findings, the takeaways. But then followed by that, Kinder Institute puts together a research brief to bring it all together in this written form. So we have these two really great deliverables that are available to the organization so they can reflect on them, but then also to other organizations as well, as we really want to support and strengthen the nonprofit data ecosystem. So that's what a little bit of why you're here and what you're going to hear about. And so, as I mentioned today, Wesley Community Center is the organization that we're focused on. And so I'm going to hand it over now to Amy Corin, their Chief Executive Officer, to share a little bit about Wesley if you are new to them.
Hey everyone, this is Amy Corin. It's good to see all of you. What a great group. Thank you for coming out today, as Jessica said, to hear about the case study. We're really excited to have participated in it. I think many of you know Wesley Community Center, but if you don't, I'll give you a little bit of an overview. We were launched in 1904, so we've been around for almost 121 years. We're in the near north side. That's just north of downtown. We serve folks from all over the community though. This is our mission and vision on the screen. I'm not going to read it, but our basic job at Wesley and our basic thrust is to help people become self-sufficient and financially stable. And so we do that in a variety of ways. And we also provide supportive services to help people stand back up when they've fallen down because life happens. We have also been a United Way agency since the mid-70s, so about 50 years. So we have a long relationship with United Way. This is a little bit about the community center. So again, the center circle really says it all. It's strengthening families, and we do that in a variety of ways. Kind of our core way is to help people become financially stable through better, higher paying jobs with a career ladder and chance for advancement and higher wages, surrounded by a lot of adult education services around financial education and coaching, computer training, GED and ESL classes when needed. So that's kind of our core offering, but we also know that life happens. And so we provide a huge suite of basic needs services. We have a thriving food pantry, which serves thousands of folks per year. And we offer rent and utility assistance, as well as access to benefits through our navigation services. So this is just a snapshot of last year. We served thousands of people. A huge bulk of those folks were in our pantry, which saw a 50% increase in number of people coming from 2023 to 2024. We have a lot of people coming into our financial coaching and adult education and workforce services. A large bulk of those people are returners, so we continue to coach people year after year as needed, or to help them continue to move up the ladder. And then we also have early quality care for children and youth, and a vibrant seniors program for folks, lower income seniors, mainly in the neighborhood, to come for companionship and congregate meals. Yeah, so that's about it. I think we have one more slide, Jessica, but we can skip that one because it is mainly for volunteers, not for other agencies. It's ways you can help out. So that is Wesley. We're grateful to be in this project. Really excited about the learnings. They were very cool, and I hope you enjoy them too. And I'm going to kick it over to Lee at the Kinder Institute to start going through that.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much, Amy. I'm going to set up my screen right now. Let's see. I think this is the one that I want. How do we look? Good? Cool. Cool. Okay, and I'm going to set up the faces, Zoom, so I don't feel like I'm talking into the void. Hi, everybody. I'm Lee. I'm at the Kinder Institute. I'm a research analyst. Also, coffee and quality. I have my coffee with me. I hope some other people do as well. But thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to talk about some of the work that we've been doing with Wesley and with United Way on this case study, which is now our third. Before we get started, I'd like to shout out Dan Potter, Lauren Dawson, Shaylee, Chen Trister, and the rest of the Kinder Institute team. This was a collaborative group effort, not just with Wesley United Way, but also here at the Kinder Institute at Rice. So shout out to them. And let's get started. Okay, so quick agenda for what we'll be discussing today is we'll go give an overview of this case study, the structure of the case study work that we've been doing as part of Coffee and Quality with United Way. Again, this is our third iteration, and we'll talk a little bit about the specifics working with Wesley. And then we'll get into some of the research questions that we developed collaboratively with Wesley United Way, talk about how we built out our analytic plan, some of the results, and then take a step back and some of our observations with regard to those results. So the goals are twofold. The first is to specifically work with Wesley to look at their data, better understand it, and better understand their programming, their offerings, their impact, and ways that they may be able to improve some of those programming. And the second goal is to, at a sort of higher level, at a meta level, is to pull out some insights that we can share with the broader nonprofit community here in the greater Houston area, and I mean ideally beyond that as well, because there are important things that we can learn from specific cases, and there are a lot of similar experiences across nonprofits, as I'm sure most of you can attest to. And so the process that we take here is a partnership model. We're very focused on collaboration and iteration at the Kinder Institute, and specifically in these case studies with the United Way. And so what we do is we co-create research questions and study designs and analytic plans with the organizations that we partner with. And then we go get the data, do the processing, run the analyses, and then run this collaborative iterative cycle where we pull in some findings, we talk to our partner, we better understand the findings, and then we update our analytic plan to inform more specifically the organization. And so it's a much more applied version of doing research, which we focus on here at Kinder. And of course, you're here for the dissemination of findings as well. That's one of the most important parts. So here are the two research questions that we co-created with Wesley, with United Way. The first was we were interested in looking at the Financial Opportunities Center at Wesley Community Center. This is one of many different offerings that they have, as you saw from Amy's presentation. But we wanted to see the relationship between individuals in the FOC and financial stability outcomes. The second question was, and the first research as well, we also wanted to look at timeline. So the percentage of individuals who were reaching certain benchmarks, as well as how long it took to get there, right? And then the second research question was, are there predictive relationships between programs at like specifically within the FOC and some of these outcomes? And so are we able to identify particular programs that might be more effective or places that might need support? And then before we get into the actual analytics here, an important part of especially working with some of the data that is applied and practitioner oriented and everything is operationalizing what exactly your outcome variables are, like what you're actually going to be able to like get your arms around, right? And so operationalizing financial stability, right, it requires some decisions. And so we have 4 different categories that we talked about with Wesley and their education, earnings, banking, and savings. Then you'll see on the right-hand side the benchmarks that we used for this particular study. Of course, this is a scoping sort of thing. And so for the quick turnaround on this project, we focused on these like very specific benchmarks. But of course, for organizations, over the long term, these can be very multifaceted and numerous. So for education, we looked at program participation and completion. And so we looked at adult basic education, vocational work, and college certifications. And so we looked at enrolling in those and then also completing those, right, among the people who enrolled. And then for earnings, we were calling it living wage. I have an asterisk there. You can see it. We used the $15 an hour, 40 hours per week metric, right? Like, and we want to acknowledge that is a potentially overly simplified and mostly historical sort of metric. And again, this is a scoping issue as well, right? Like this can be recalculated and changed around to better fit different needs of an organization. But this is what we use specifically for this project. Banking, we looked at whether or not a bank account was open, checking or savings, like while enrolled at Wesley. And then we were looking at 3 different thresholds of savings, amount of like money in savings accounts while enrolled at Wesley. It's any amount of savings, right? At least $100 and then over $500. So to get into that first research question, to what extent and along what timeline are people reaching these benchmarks? Analytically, this was really a lot of descriptive statistics, which is we were just looking at percentages, proportions of individuals who were enrolled in various different data sets who hit some of those benchmarks that I just talked about. And then we also wanted to look at, sort of summarizing the typical amount of time it took to reaching those benchmarks. And so I'm taking a step back here. We're going to throw some numbers at you. I'm happy to return to these during the Q&A. So don't be overwhelmed. We put the really important ones in very big font. And so, you can look at those. But for education, this is adult basic education. So the typical time it took until enrollment in that program was 4 days. And this is a bit of a trend with the education stuff. This is the median number of days among all clients in the enrolled in or who became enrolled in education programs. Typically about 4 days, and then almost 80% ended up the ABE programs. Looking at vocational training programs, again, similar 8 days, a little bit over a week in terms of like the median number, the typical number of days, the 50th percentile of days it took to enroll in those programs. And again, about 75% completing those. And then something important to note here for both of these is that we did not find any association between completing the programs and entry levels of education, right? Which is somewhat heartening, we might think. And so that's sort of a trend as well that we. And then finally, looking at the the enrollment and completion of college certificate programs. This one, deviates from the trend. There's 128 days as a median number of enrollment. However, again, it's about 70% of folks who do end up enrolling complete it successfully. And again, the likelihood of completing it is not dependent on the amount of education that you come into the program with. So let's talk about earnings now. And again, living wage, I threw up the asterisk up there again, all of the limitations of different ways of thinking about what living wage, is. But to be clear about what we were looking at as our metric, about 19% of clients enrolled at Wesley reached the living wage while they were enrolled, right? So they didn't come in with it. It was something that they reached, which I think is important to note. The time that it took was about 300 days. That's the median amount of time. And so it took longer than enrolling in and completing these education programs, but maybe that might make sense, right? Thinking about different outcomes and measures and whatnot. Looking at banking, to continue with the finances, is 9% opened a checking or a savings account while at Wesley. And that one took about 78 days if it was going to happen. And then savings wise, so among the folks who were enrolled at Wesley who have any amount of money in savings, it's about 30%. Among those people who have any amount of savings, more than 70% had at least $100 in savings. And then if you look at the individuals who have at least $100 in savings, almost 67% of them have more than $500 of savings. So that's one of the key findings that we want to point to, is the importance of that $100. So shifting into our second research question here, this has to do with the relationship between specific programs within the Financial Opportunity Center and their predictive abilities with certain outcomes. So these are the programs that we looked at that we had in our various data sets: employment counseling, financial coaching, income supports, and work and education supports. You can see different examples on the right-hand side. There were a variety of these, but these were just some that I pulled out. And so our analysis plan here was to essentially say, if people were engaged with these programs, did they have one or more? And then if they were at Wesley, but they did not engage with these programs, that's how they were coded. And so 0, they didn't receive any services, but they were at Wesley. 1, they received one or more. And then in terms of the outcomes, we did it binary dichotomously. And so 0 was you did not reach the benchmark. 1 is did reach the benchmark. And the way that we approached it was to test the relationship between whether or not you had a service or more in these 4 different categories while controlling for each other. And so this was in a binary logistic regression. This is just a way of testing the predictive ability of different variables while controlling for other factors. And so in this case, we were just controlling for involvement with other programs so that we don't have to worry about, my involvement with, let's say, income supports, was actually the reason that I see a relationship between employment counseling and the outcome. And we can talk some more about that if need be. So the results here are that in terms of financial stability benchmarks, we saw that financial coaching and also work and education support positively predicted the completion of the ABE programming. And so if you received one or more services in financial coaching or work and education support, you were more likely to complete that program, that educational program. And I'll also say that the effects of these were pretty big, like they were pretty stark. And so like there was a strong relationship is what I'll say. And that, again, that's controlling for engagement with other services or not. And then in terms of the probability of receiving a living wage, receiving employment counseling services positively predicted that as well. That wasn't as strong as an effect as the first bullet, but again, there's this positive relationship there. And then finally, we found some interesting results here with looking at savings, and that is something we can unpack in the Q&A if people are interested, because I have some thoughts on it, but I don't know that I have the time right now to get into all of them. But basically, receiving income support services was a negative predictor of it, whereas, I mean, at the same time, receiving work and education support services was a positive predictor. And there's a lot to talk about here in terms of what prediction versus like causality means. And so we can't assume that any of these relationships are causal, but it's just more information that can help inform programming, right, and demonstration of impact without, mistaking it for causality and making choices based on that. So to take a little bit of a step back here, this is a quick summary. These are of our specific findings. I think Kelly's going to talk a little bit more about the sort of more general ones, but basically enrollment in education programs was pretty early, as you saw, but we also found that the maximum number of days that it took to get enrolled into a program was pretty big, and then we also saw that 70% plus number, I think all of them actually, and so it's also important to note that when they started didn't affect their likelihood of success. Also, the education level that they came in with did not affect their likelihood of success, or it didn't have a relationship with their likelihood of success. Living wage, that one took longer, and it was almost a year in terms of the typical number of days. But again, these have huge maximums, which shows that people who are engaged for a long time, they're still reaching these benchmarks, right? Like, and that's important too. It's not like, if you don't get it in 50 days, then game over, right? Opening a checking account, it would happen early. It was going to happen, right? And the percentage was a little bit lower there, But again, that all of these findings have to be taken into context of like what these outcome variables actually mean for individuals and for the organization. And then the final thing that we wanted to note was that with regard to the savings findings, it seems a little bit like without drawing too strong of a conclusion, there seem to be two hurdles: is to get any amount of money in savings, and then to get over $100, because we saw the majority of individuals, almost the vast majority of individuals who had $100, were ending up with more than $500 of savings, and so that can be a little bit more of a manageable benchmark, right? Than sort of like telling somebody coming in is like you have to get $1,000. And that's where we're going to call it for the Kinder Institute. Again, happy to elaborate on some of these findings in the question and answer, but I'm going to kick it over to Kelly now over at Wesley to round us out. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lee. We appreciate it. My name is Kelly Prucknell. I'm the Director of Data Management here at Wesley Community Center. And before I get started, I just wanted to take a minute to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to the United Way and to the Kinder Institute, to Jessica and Ashley and Dan and Lee and Lauren and everyone. This has been a wonderful experience for us, a great opportunity. We wouldn't have the time and resources to do this if it wasn't for this opportunity. So just wanted to say thank you before we jump into the takeaways. Jessica, if you go to the first slide. So I'm going to talk about the takeaways from the Wesley perspective, and I'm going to break it down into kind of two major categories. First, the programmatic takeaways, and then the data-centric takeaways. And there are many that aren't on here, but this is just sort of our big picture thoughts. First, when we were given this opportunity, we first it was like, wow, that's great. We have a lot of data. What do we do? So we knew we wanted to focus on our FOC simply because we do have 15 years of history with this program, and it has the biggest breadth of data of any of our programs. We have lots of programs and lots of data, but we collect a whole lot more with our FOC clients than we do with some of our other clients. So we knew we had a lot to work with. We said, okay, this is great. And we're at this 15-year history point. So what do we want to do? And Sam Sherman, our Chief Program Officer, and I and Amy and others, we talked about it. And we really just wanted to know what the secret sauce is for the FOC. We kept saying that, what's the secret sauce? What really matters? We collect lots of data. You all know at all of your agencies, we are always collecting information. We're constantly changing what information we collect. So we have a lot there, but what really matters? What is it telling us? And then when we look at it, what does it mean to be successful, to reach these benchmarks? And so we talked about it a lot, talked to Kinder about what those 4 benchmarks were and how to define them. And you could see there's certainly some complications on some of them, like Lee was talking about with the living wage. It's not as simple as that, but that's, you had to have a place to work from. So it was a lot to think through, but this was the outcome we have. You just saw all of the different, what affects what, participating in this program, how does it affect your success in graduating from an education program or from this or that. And so that was really important for us to think through, and to now we kind of have this information of, all right, these are certain things that we should focus on going forward. I wanted to call out a couple of the specific takeaways that Lee mentioned earlier. One that we've talked about a lot now is that savings piece. We all, Jessica, Sam, and myself, kind of had like a, oh my gosh, that's amazing moment when we saw the, once clients reach that $100 benchmark, that it's, very likely that you'll reach $500 or more. Not trying to downplay the fact that a $100 benchmark is hard to reach. That was part of the findings as well. If you're a client and you're working paycheck to paycheck, saving $1 is difficult, let alone 100. So not trying to minimize that, but the finding that you could end up at this really high savings amount, something that you get you towards owning a car or owning a home, is hopefully something that we can use to motivate our clients of, if you can just get started and get to this one place, start with $5 a week, whatever it is that you can do, and you can reach this 100. Look at all the people who went before you, almost 70% of which reached, a much higher level of savings. And so it's something that can be really powerful for us to use to show our clients what's possible. Same with the education completion rates, looking at both our bridge program, the ABE that Lee was mentioning, the vocational programs, college certificates. The fact that the lowest of those was 70% completion rate over the history that we have was really exciting to see, because often we see it, cohort by cohort. So you can see, this percent of people finish this cohort. But when you look at the whole history and how successful it's been, was really exciting. And hopefully we can also use that with our clients to say, we know this is difficult to starting a new program, taking the time, the 6 weeks, the however long it is to do this. But look at the history of success of everyone making it through. And so that's another important piece that we can use. It's also motivational for us as staff. We all know working in this field that it can be very difficult, but when we get to look at how much success we've had, it meant a lot to me. It meant a lot to Sam. I know there's at least a couple FOC staff members here and a few others from Wesley. So hopefully this also feels motivational for you, because this is your hard work. This is our FOC and all the work that they do. This is showing that success. So just bravo. I wanted to shout everyone out who's here and who's not here. And lastly, the other piece I wanted to bring up, because it's a little more complex, is the income support piece. So you saw there was a negative correlation of income supports and savings. And we know that's something that we need to think about more and to kind of dig in. It's not a simple relationship. Clients who come to us and are receiving our income supports, maybe that means that they're not at a point where they're ready to fully engage with the FOC. Maybe they need to be more, and oftentimes they are, working through case management and navigation programs before they're in the FOC. There's lots of complexity to that, but it's something that we are going to use to think about how we do that work going forward. Next slide, please, Jessica. So the other takeaways were all around data, which I remember listening to the Alexander JFS presentation, and it was similar, because when you're looking at 15 years of very complex data, you notice a lot of things. We knew this before we started, that certainly it's very important to have clean, accurate data. That's part of what my job is and what I'm here for, but this really highlighted it as we looked at all of this information. A few things that stood out. One is around exiting clients. So our FOC and many of the other FOCs, it's not a simple program where there's a specified exit date. Our clients are sometimes with us for 10 years or more. They come and go. It's not just, you finish this education program and you're done. It's much more ongoing than that. So we don't often exit a lot of clients because of that. However, there are times where we have clients who haven't been interacting with us for years, in which case it's time to exit them, so that we don't have ongoing pieces of information that we collect on an ongoing basis that are then not getting fulfilled. If we exit them, then that's no longer a problem. So we already had some procedures in place for this, but it's something that we haven't done a very good job of doing on a regular basis. So this was something that we now know going forward is important for us to work on. Same with missing information. Everyone here knows that it's often hard to get information from clients, especially if it's after their first interaction with us. But it's often really important information that we want to collect on an ongoing basis. Again, we have some procedures in place for that, of how many times to contact a client and who is doing it. But this highlights that maybe we need to continue to think about that and update how we do it. Especially because one thing I wanted to point out is that often clients will sometimes not respond to us for many different reasons. It could be good, bad, neither. But a lot of the times when our clients are doing well, that's when they don't answer the call because they're doing great. They're like, we don't need you right now. I'm got a new job. Everything is good. But then we're missing out on that good information, the increase in income, a new job, a new education, a new degree, in which case some of those metrics that you saw earlier would even look even better if we had some of that information too. So it kind of highlights that piece of everything. Lastly, the other thing that is important is thinking about our unknown and other data. It's always good to have an option for other in your databases and your intakes, especially when it comes to demographic information. It's important to have that so that everyone feels like there's a place where they can fit on a form, but we can reduce those number of other data if we have more options. So for especially, gender, race, ethnicity, even things like, how did you hear about us? Instead of just a walk-in, a referral, and a flyer, if you add social media and e-blast and all the other things, you start to reduce those numbers of other data. So that's another thing that we will think about, is adding even more options to our intakes and other forms. The other big data takeaway that you're probably tired of hearing about by now, if you do a lot with coffee and quality, are the importance of data dictionaries. That's been a hot button topic, especially in the past year or so, but it is really important. And this very much brought that to the forefront for us. We are fortunate that we did have some data dictionaries in place already, but we are a complex organization with lots of different databases and programs. And so we have some data dictionaries for some things and not for others, and they're not always fully complete. And we needed that for this, to be able to provide Kinder with our data to explain what it is. What is our data? Here's 1,000 spreadsheets, but what are these data points? What do they mean? What does this value mean versus this value? So that's something that is high on at least my priority list for going forward, is creating new data dictionaries, and also very important is to keep them evergreen. So it's one thing to have a data dictionary, it's another thing to keep it up, which does require a lot of time and effort. I know will be a lot going forward, but the nature of our work is that we are constantly changing. We add new programs all the time. Other programs go away. We add new services within certain programs. Funders start asking for new metrics that we weren't tracking before. And every time a change like that happens, we're trying to keep up. We add a new service log into our system, but how are we tracking in a written form that this happened and this happened at this date? A good example that happened during this process was looking at all of our savings data. Kinder came back to us and said, we see a lot of zero values for savings. Does that mean that they have a zero balance, or does that mean they don't have a savings account? And that's the kind of thing that if you have a data dictionary, you know exactly what that means. And if it changed at some point in history, then you have that record as well. So, your data from before 2020 means one thing and afterwards means another thing. So those were all really eye-opening outcomes for us, among many other things. But with that, I will turn it back over to Jessica for some other findings.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much, Kelly, for sharing the takeaways. Lee, thank you for walking everyone through the analysis, the findings. Amy, thank you for leading off and sharing more about Wesley and what y'all are and who you serve and what you do. I want to connect two dots that Kelly was, mentioning ever so lovingly about the data dictionaries and the importance of that. But I want to connect two dots before we get into the Q&A. Two dots really around like, okay, so you're hearing this and maybe you are not a part of Wesley and you're like, how can I take this back into my organization? And two really important ways to bring this back, to transfer this for you, is number one, establish and or update your data dictionaries regularly. Callie said it beautifully when she mentioned that they're collecting data, but it's constantly changing. And so how do you find this space where you can have a data dictionary that's evergreen, knowing that it's going to change and ebb and flow as your program work ebbs and flows. And so trying to find that commonality, that constant for your data dictionary is just a place to get started. Take it one bite at a time, one page at a time, one data element at a time to really start to define it, to establish. And then you can get into okay, so how do I update this to where it feels like just a natural flow for me to update it so it's reflecting the work we're currently doing? And so that is one recommendation. And then the other one too is, and she mentioned it with the zero for savings, and is that they do not have any savings, or it is that they in fact have zero savings. And so it was kind of the nuance between those two. It's that, that common challenge you have when you have missing data or unknown data. And so how do you define that? And so having a procedure to identify what way to navigate when you're forced into that fork in the road. And so that is the other recommendation as a way to find your forks in the road where you want to define to know, well, if I go this path, it's this. And if I go this path, it's that. And then that will ensure that consistency across your staff that are maybe entering the data, that are looking at the data, using the data, sharing the data. And so you can have that for all. So those are the two that I wanted to like directly point you to as like how you can take this back and bring this to your organization. And so we've now reached the Q&A. And so we want to hear from you. Please feel free to go use the raise hand feature if you want to speak aloud. I'd love to hear your voice, or put it in the chat if you have a question about the case study, the findings, the process. We would love to have the dialogue now. I have a question I'm going to tee up to Wesley because it is a common challenge and it is faced by a lot of organizations where, yeah, Lee even said it, like things are multifaceted and you have numerous data points and numerous metrics, and those pesky funders want to like add in more and more to what you measure, what you collect. And so you had a lot of metrics to start out with for the FOC and like what you were looking at. And so there was a point in the case study early on where it was, okay, you could look at all and like maybe not have a lot of detail, or like find 4 specific ones that they can draw into the analysis. And so y'all narrowed it down into those 4 to living wage, education, bank status, and savings. And so can y'all walk us through a little bit more, like let us behind the curtain to hear how that was for you to narrow into those 4 success measures?
It's a great question, and it was intimidating because there is a lot. We took a lot of time to think through several things. One is, what are some that are very commonly asked by a lot of different funders. So we knew that they were going to keep being asked. So those are important to focus on. And then we really focused in on the 4 that we did for kind of different reasons for all of them. So first, thinking about the education programs and completion rates, that is one of the cornerstones of the FOC. It has been since it began. Our bridge programs are kind of what we're known for. And so that was really important for us to look at, because even though it has worked for us in the past, is it still working for us? Is it really working as good as we think it is? And so that was something that we wanted to investigate, especially as we think going forward. We've had this 15 years of history, but what do the next 15 years look like? And so we don't want to just assume because it worked in the past that it will going forward. So education was important for that. Income and living wage is a foundational question that we are all trying to get to. That's important for our clients. If you reach that status of having a living wage, being able to support your family, that's fundamental. And so that was one of those. We know that from the beginning that had to be in there. Thinking about banking was almost an opposite of the other 2, because it's something we've had variable success with, and it's something that we don't do with all of our clients. It's more of a financial coaching versus employment coaching piece, even though it's not that cut and dry, but because it was more variable over time, that was something we wanted to look at. Why is that? Is there some relationships there? And then finally, savings is an important question because of asset building for sure, but its relationship to resiliency. And that's a big part of our work now, is thinking about being resilient. How do you handle a disaster? We live in Houston. How do you handle a medical emergency? And so that speaks to that resiliency piece. So those were all kind of different reasons for all 4, but that's how we finally narrow down the big list into those 4.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. There's like four things there that you really lifted up that are so like great guiding light for when you're trying to determine like what are the top success measures for you. And that was the funder, right? Like so the commonality of funder, like they're putting emphasis on this. So okay, yeah, let's level that up. But then you also leveled up like your curiosity, like why banking? And so that is another one that's really good to flex your ability to be like the subject matter experts in your work. Like you are seeing this, you, Sam, your team, the amazing team at Wesley, like, and what is it about savings? It's that thing that's like that curiosity that can maybe lead to something that you can really better understand bank status and look at that relationship from bank status to the $100 to the $500 as those two hurdles. And without that curiosity, you maybe wouldn't have had that in that insider finding. And so that was really cool. And then that resiliency relationship, like you're focused too on there and just kind of what's happening. And so kind of keeping a pulse at what's going on in your program and where you're going and what you're doing as a way to kind of like navigate through like, well, what measures matter to us? Yeah. Amy, anything you would add into that for y'all for those success measures?
No, I think I'm just really happy with the process and the way we were allowed to kind of go back and forth and figure out the best route, and just, just really happy with the process and the results, all of which we can learn a ton from. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for that. And that's a really good note too, because I think that's part of the experience of the case study. So the organizations, I can remember with Angel Reach, they were our first one. It's the act of like looking at your data, having someone else look at it, analyzing that's uncovering some things that you're like, oh, what is this? What is that? And that openness to continuously learning and growing in that space has been just like such a stellar moment across all three case studies. And that lifts up like the thing that came in the analysis too. And so I know, this case study, the data you shared spanned across 2011 to 2024. And so Lee, I'm curious, or anybody from Kinder, I'm curious about, when you're analyzing data across that many years, you are bound to find some missing data, some gaps in your data, like, oh, all the potholes you will find and encounter. And so what do you see as like the best way to navigate that space when you have missing or incomplete data in your data set?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. Just I wanted to say one thing too to the sort of the conversation about like which outcomes to focus on, because I think there's an important part, not just like in this specific type of research, but in sort of like conducting or interpreting any kind of research findings is making sure you know the operationalization. And so like understanding like, because we could come out and say like, oh, we found this relationship between this program and like financial stability, but we're talking about the metric of living wage, and we're talking about the metric of living wage in the way that we operationalize it, right? The 15 an hour for 40 hours a week, right? And like those two things could communicate very different messages to people. And so I think a responsible way of disseminating findings is to be very upfront and clear about how you've operationalized them, but also a way of like digesting and consuming research is to sort of inquire about and investigate like the way that people are operationalizing things. I think that's just another important piece. Just to that point. To shift over to the missingness, the most important part to me is understand like relating it to the data collection process. And so the challenge with dealing with missingness when you haven't been involved in the data collection is it's unclear if, for example, different types of missingness have really different meanings, right? Like so like the difference between somebody entering a value incorrectly is vastly different from somebody not participating in a program when they could have. But both of those two situations could produce an empty little Excel cell, right? And so in my mind, understanding the collection process can help inform the way that missing values are coded, like the way that they're identified. And so when you have that, they don't have to be empty boxes, right? Like you could have a 999 and like that indicates that this person did not have the opportunity to be in this program. And so maybe that gives information about a data entry error or something like that. Whereas like, an 888 like indicates that it indicates another thing. And so the values are not important, but like the importance is understanding how the data collection relates to missingness. And then the second point that I would make is thinking about what missingness can be introduced when you try to collide different data sets together. And so if you have separate systems that control, like if you have, let's just for an example, like you have a different data set for one program versus another. If you want to look at the relationship between those two programs and the clients involved in each, you can put those two data sets together. But if clients from this A data set are missing in the B data set, like what does that mean? Right? Like, does that mean that they like substantively were not involved in whatever data collection process was going on in data set B? Or does it mean that maybe they weren't referred to or they weren't like recorded as being involved in it, but they may have been involved? It's just, it has a lot in my mind to do with the data collection process and thinking through sort of like the entire life cycle of a data point. But Dan, please feel free to jump in there if you have other insights.
I mean, I think the key is that missingness can carry meaning. Is that,
yeah,
and that's exactly what you're pointing to, Lee, is that missingness because I was supposed to ask somebody a question and I didn't is different from I never was supposed to ask that person that question in the first place. And so any way that we can go through that process of having different types of missingness to allow for that meaning to come out of the missingness becomes really critical. And again, it kind of pushes, as we think about the way in which data come in, how do we move from missing as a blank box that again, to lead to your point, there's an absence of information there, to begin to build in ways of trying to say, hey, this is missing, but it's missing for reason A, reason B, or reason C, so that when we are looking and reflecting on data in the future, again, you've got a little bit more information. And so to me, I always distill it down to missingness has meaning. How do you capture that? And you're absolutely right about it's during the data collection process. And Kelly was talking about this earlier. How are we updating our documentation along the way so that as that meaning might be changing, you're snagging it so that, again, that future self, it's all about being good to our future selves. It's how are we setting our future selves up to know what it is we're doing, collecting today.
And a last point that I'll make on this sort of is just affirming that like it's difficult, like and this is not like easy even for like professional researchers, and this also I think applies to keeping a like living and very structured and supremely informative like data dictionary. Like these are not easy things, and so I think it's also important to affirm that like I mean like there is low hanging fruit in terms of like practices, but at the end of the day too, it's just like I think there needs to be some affirmation of just like these aren't things that you can just snap your fingers and do. I mean, I know in my grad program it was very theoretical and we didn't talk much about the importance of missingness, and then I started trying to analyze data sets where I'm just like I'm not sure what these missing values mean, and then I have to go back to the do some of my own like training, and so that's another point that I don't want to get lost. I never want to get lost, is just that like some of these things are like not super easy or clear even to people who have been trained in data and statistics and everything. And so just making that clear as well to folks that, this is all about development and growth and not about like, oh, I messed up by not doing it.
Thank you, Lee and Dan. I really appreciate that. Like the better understanding the data collection, and like there's no better source than the direct staff that are in doing the work, getting that information from clients. I know there are some FOC coaches on the call, and I bet they're like, I know what the zero means, or like, here's how the zero can come up in those situations. And so having that knowledge matched with like the data collection process, the data analyzing process can just make it so much better and so much able for you to use the information that you're collecting. And so really glad y'all lifted that point up to know like we're all in this boat together with missing data. And so how do we navigate that in the real world and with nonprofits, with the work happening in the community. And so really glad to hear that. Um, I also had another question for Kelly and Amy about Wesley, and because there were some really great takeaways Kelly pulled up for how you're going to use it programmatically, how you're going to use the findings for like your data, your overall data efforts. You know, Kelly, I know you mentioned like defining the exit for clients because not everything has like a beautiful graduation date. And then you also mentioned a little bit about unknowns or other data. I know some people have a lot of feelings about having that unknown, their other, just as an option. And so I'm curious if you can tell me a little bit of like, I'm wondering how you're going to take these takeaways outside of the FOC and into some of your other program areas, if you've been thinking about that at all.
Yeah, that's a great question because, you know, the FOC is only one small, not small, it's one part of what we do. And yeah, I think basically everything that we've learned can apply to all of our programs, especially thinking specifically about all the data takeaways, because we do have one unified, I guess, CRM, our database, Apricot 360 is what we use for all of our programs. And so we have a data dictionary for parts of that, but not for everything. And that's where we need to start with some of those, with the data dictionaries and data practices can apply to every program, especially within that framework. And so I think that's kind of where we can start. And then there's a lot of other offshoots that each program has its own other, you know, repositories and funder required databases and such that all also need similar dictionaries and processes that I think taking what we've learned here and doing essentially the exact same thing in every program will work wonderfully and is important to do. You know, some things are a little bit different, like exiting clients looks different for families that are in our like early Head Start versus in the FOC, certainly, but the general ideas of good data practices will apply to any of our programs. And so that is on the table and definitely what we need to do. So yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Because I think a lot of times too, people can think like, oh, I should just standardize. Like, let's do it the same across every program. And like in some organizations and in some work that's happening, that would make sense. Like, yes, double down on standardizing across the board. However, when you have different programs, when you have the different focus, it does make sense to make sure it fits within that program's environment, but having the data dictionary, the data procedures that to fit what's happening there. That's a great kind of like, how do I transfer this to the other program areas note? Amy, anything you would add into that? You kind of see the whole like bird's eye view of Wesley and what could be the possibility here.
No, I think what Kelly said is great. And I think, yeah, so some organizations are more have a focus, have a core focus, and some are a little broader like Wesley. And so, of course, we always have to kind of think about what fits best for our different services. But I would just say on a slightly different tangent that the results, these results are really interesting to present out, to use outside of improving programs and really kind of talking about results. And I think it's interesting to share this kind of it'll be interesting to share this information with stakeholders on the outside as well. And just kind of, you know, show how seriously we take data and how important our partners are in helping us understand it. So that was a little bit not what you asked, but I wanted to make sure I shared it.
Yeah, no, I love it. Like, yeah, stand on the soapbox. Yeah. Because I have one more question to Lee, but I mean, you did mention your soapbox about savings, but I want to make sure if anybody else has questions, please drop them in the chat or come off on mute. Because the other thing, you know, it's interesting because we kind of see, of course, in the case study, Wesley sees the analysis, sees some of the preliminary findings. So they know what's coming. Today, I promise you, it's not the first time they've seen these findings. And so I'll hold my question because Linda has a question that's in the chat. And so her question comes, how many years of data would you recommend having before doing this kind of case study? Yeah, so when you have this kind of like, you need a little bit more, what I'll use the word longitudinal data set. Curious from Kinder, what do you think when you're trying to analyze, like answer these kind of questions, how many years do you need?
I'll just jump in first really quickly. I mean, my first thought is these case studies are supposed to be sort of like demonstrations of how data can be utilized to inform programming and organizations operation. And so um, my thinking about the role of data collection and analysis in nonprofit organizations is that it can be real time. It can and maybe should be real time. And so there doesn't have to be sort of and like Jessica said, it depends on the questions that are trying to be answered, which really drives a lot of it. But I mean, data collection and analysis and sort of its utility can be done in real time and can be started and honestly should be, right? And so that's just my knee-jerk reaction, is just that like the case study is driven by the research questions that are co-created, right? And so the research question, if you have the kind of research question of just like what is our 5-year or our long-term impact or our long-term education completion rate, are you interested in 5 years? Are you interested in 10 years? Right? Like it depends very much on what you're interested in or what your funder is interested in, or sort of the questions that you're trying to answer. But I also would caution against sort of thinking that like there needs to be a lot of data collected before it can be utilized. And actually the opposite, I think, is probably the best, because the more that you collect and try to understand and apply like in real time, I think the better the data collection can be refined and sort of improved upon, as long as it's connected specifically to the questions that are trying to be answered. And then other folks feel free to jump in and weigh in. But that was my initial reaction.
Yeah.
So a big part of it is going to be a reflection of the program you're interested in looking at. So, and I think Kelly offers us some of the insight about the messiness that oftentimes nonprofits are going to be grappling with, where you can be enrolled in a program that, and here I'm thinking about some of the education stuff, and Kelly, please feel free to help fill in some of the blanks I might have on this, but that person who's working through Wesley for something like a college certificate or a college degree program is signing up for a program that is multiple years in the making. It's I'm in it for the long haul. Whereas there may be other programs that there's almost certainly other programs Wesley is offering where their timeline from start to completion is gonna be tighter. And so, to sort of build a little bit of concrete around that idea of you don't have to wait 5 years to have data to begin looking at it, reflect on the program. If you've got a program that genuinely you want to allow people to have 2, 3, 4 years to complete, we are talking about data collection taking place for 2, 3, or 4 years. If you've got a program that's 2 or 3 months to complete, absolutely, like hop in there with some of those data. Learn what's, is this program completion rate high? Are there dropout? What might be barriers? What might be, things that are accelerating success, right? Those types of things can be captured in real time as things are happening. And so it's a little bit of a loosey-goosey, but I think in the reality of how nonprofits are oftentimes working, there's going to need to be a little bit of flexibility. And then to finish on a point of Kelly's, just because I finished an education program doesn't mean I'm done. Like there can literally be a graduation that occurred, but that's a transition point into the next service or program or effort that nonprofits might be having. And so it can get very messy. And so with that, there's no firm like 5 years kind of an
Yeah.
answer. I think it's that like reflecting on what is it you're looking to do with your data.
Also, last thing to say on this, sorry, I'm taking a lot of airspace, but I do want to say too, like if they are these 5+ multiple year sort of questions, like it becomes even more important to think through how the data is beginning to be collected. This ties in back to the data dictionary stuff that we were talking about, because if you look back and you're like, we have data for 10+ years, but 8+ of those years, the data is different over the years and it's not super useful, then that's a lot of I don't want to say wasted, but wasted potential, right? And so like the longer term these research questions are, like the more important it is to really think through ahead of time, like what questions are we trying to answer and like what data do we need and how can we ensure that that's high quality data. Because the worst thing in the world is just like having a ton of data that just like you can't use. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, let's not collect data for data's sake. Yeah. No, thank you both, because it really goes back to like what's the question they're trying to answer in the case study, because then that can help know like, well, how many years. But then what Lee was speaking to at the end was really about the quality of the data as it's being collected and that length. But then also we kind of run into, because you could ask this same question about how much data should you have? So how big is the data set? This one for Wesley, it was a pretty large data set in my opinion, whereas our very first case study didn't have a very large data set. I think it was maybe 100 records if I had to like guess off the top of my head. So 100 compared to, 1,000 plus, probably closer to like 3,000 if they want to check me on that one. I mean, there's some differences there, right? But both of them had questions they were trying to answer with their data. And so getting really clear on what is it you're trying to know, what is it trying to understand, what questions do you have? And so this case study, it's kind of going on about Wesley saw these results before before today. And so a part of that was the results on education. We were looking at time from enrollment to the success. And I know Kendra shared like the mean, median, the max, the shortest time, the longest time. There's all these data time points that they were sharing. And then it was interesting today when I saw the presentation that they popped out like, well, here is the median days to the success. And so I'm curious if y'all can just give us a little guidance on how do you toggle between like using mean or median when you're trying to analyze your data and communicate your data across two different points.
Yeah, measures of central tendency are fun.
I know, geek out with us on statistics, please. I know there's some really heavy like stat people in this room who she's laughing. I can see Alicia laughing on this. So yes, there's some there. Yes, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, and part of it really does come back to the sample you're working with. The larger your sample, in theory, the more these measures of central tendency. So there we're talking about mean, median, even mode sometimes gets thrown in there. The more and more cases you have, the more those should be aligning with one another. And so if you've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of data points, your measure of central tendency can, under many circumstances, become less important which one you pick. When you start to have smaller sample sizes, and by smaller we do mean even 1,000 cases, 100 cases, for sure, if you're working with programming where maybe you've got 50 clients that you're really involved with, which of these you end up picking can really matter based on some of what are talked about as outlier values or extreme values. Those extreme or outlier values are going to make your average start to swing around pretty wild, because your average is, let's do some math real fast. I'm taking all my values, I'm summing them up, and I'm dividing by the number of cases. If I've got one or two cases that look really different from the rest of my cases, they can pull my mean either up or down in a way that's not really reflective of the other cases, the typical cases in the sample. And this is where kind of like, what is the purpose of a measure of central tendency? The purpose of that measure is to try to give you what is the typical, what's your average client, your average partner, your average resident looking like. And so that's sort of the risk to keep in mind, is if I'm including some of these larger values, outlier values, it's moving my mean in a way that makes that statistic less and less reflective of the typical experience. Your median, on the other hand, is your 50th percentile. So you can think about taking all your clients and lining them up, and from shortest to tallest, from furthest away to closest nearby, from lowest score on something to highest score on something, whatever your metric might be, you line them up from smallest to largest, and then the median is just picking the 50th percentile. Your middle person, what is their value? When looking at the median, it's giving you a great indication of what your typical experience is looking like, again, because you're right there in the middle of the pack. And it allows for people to have really extreme values on the upper end, really extreme values on the lower end, and they're not swaying that middle value too much at all. It allows for that middle value to stay really in the middle of the pack. And so as you're thinking about how you're looking at your data, if you've got 50 clients, 100 clients, even in the case of working with Wesley's data, we were working with hundreds of clients, but as we were sort of seeing in some of those distributions, your median was 8 days, your mean was 90 days, and that's because your max was 4,000 days. These are very different experiences. Now, on the one hand, what that means is it's never too late. And that can be a good motivator. That can be a great way to talk with clients about, look, like there isn't, and Lee made this point during the presentation, you didn't miss a cutoff. There's always that opportunity to get involved. But as you're thinking about how do I talk about my data and how might I talk with clients about what the typical experience looks like, these are some of the things that can be kept in mind to figure out, like, what is this measure of central tendency that might make the most sense for me to use?
If I can add to that really quickly, like one example that helps me a lot to think about it is like if you think about the annual income of people in the United States, the average value is usually, it should not be reported, right? Because you have billionaires who are just these incredible outliers who are going to take, if you, again, you add all of them up, you divide by the number of people, if you have 1 billion versus, 50,000 in the same sort of calculation, like it's going to pull it all like really far. Whereas like median, the $1 billion is treated the same as 1 million, is treated the same as 10,000, right? Because you just line them all up. And so that's one way that I like to think about it, because it always like locks it in for me. It's just like the role of outliers. And then another thing that I want to add too is mean versus median can also show you when, because sometimes outliers are like indicators of like quote unquote bad data, or like indicators of error. And so in this actual study, like there were two outliers when we were looking at the hourly wage, where the hourly wage was like $80,000 an hour or something like that. And so like if you don't see that in the distribution, or you don't look at it or something, and then you run the average, you're going to see some crazy number that like the average number of clients are making like 10K a year or whatever. I don't know what the actual math is there, but like it can also be an indicator. If the mean and the median don't line up, that means there's big skew. That means there's some outliers. And like then you can think through some more about like, are these outliers meaningful? Like the number of days where we think those are meaningful, right? Versus 80K an hour, is that meaningful? We ended up dropping those folks. It was just 2 folks, but like those folks from analysis. But anyway, it can also be, some of these statistics can be indicators of other sort of like issues or characteristics of your data.
Yeah, the call out on the outlier is such a good like practical way to like toggle between mean and median. And it did come up, right? Like that's my favorite data quality check moment. And it came up in the analysis too, because like who was the 3-year-old that was enrolled in the Financial Opportunity Center? Like, oh, maybe not so much, right? Like, because Financial Opportunity Center is for, young adults to older adults. And so just like it's such a great way to like quality check, but then also like really know which one should I be using, mean or median? How am I using this for my analysis? And you kind of were talking about some like red flags, some like little pitfalls folks might encounter. And so Alicia has a question in the chat, or what are some classic red flags the data collected isn't true or genuine? And so some of those outliers are great ways to catch like if something's not true, something maybe feels a little off, seems a little off in your data set. Lee, Dan, Kelly, anything that comes to mind for you on this one?
I can say one thing that we've seen before on data where we've gone, wait, hold on, let's go back and double check, is when you have the same value over and over again. So let's say, I don't know if you're talking about a 10, whatever it is, and it's always, it always says 30 or whatever the number is over and over. You're like, is that real or is that something off? I know we've seen that before and been like, all right, let's go and dig in and figure out what that is for sure.
An example of that specifically from this study was we saw a bunch of, wasn't it $1 values in the savings account or something, and we saw so many. I think Dan actually was the first one to point it out, but yeah, we saw so many of those. We were just sort of like, what does this mean, right? Like it's probably unlikely that this many people only have a single dollar in a checking account, right? And it also, a lot of it depends on the ground knowledge and like sort of what you're expecting and like what you like what should be the case. That can sometimes also be a guiding.
Yeah, other key things to be looking for: negative values where there should not be any. And so a classic example there is, how old were you when you enrolled in high school? -23. That's impressive. So odds are we've got a year that's been inverted, and part of it is just go back to the raw data. There's a moment where you can get back in the raw data and you go, oh, it's not supposed to be 1978, it's 1987. And so we've got a little bit of an inverted data point here. So let's clean that up, and all of a sudden it makes sense there. Another key thing to look for is letters where there's not supposed to be letters, or numbers where there's not supposed to be numbers. And so examples there become, if you're looking at things like names, and all of a sudden there's a name 1, 2, 3, 4, that is probably trying to indicate something else. And it could be that all of a sudden data has gotten off by one cell, or again, might be indicative of, oh, this is a bad case. And so don't use this. Let's clear this out. And so those are the types of things that can oftentimes be, again, those are quick checks that really are about run your frequency distribution and just look at what that output comes back as. Do all of those values in there make sense? There's definitely like a second layer to it, which has to do with intersecting variables with one another. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Intersecting variables with one another. But yeah, for sure, just starting with the looking for wild values, looking for impossible values, and then just unpacking what that might mean.
Thank you all for that. This notion of like, your data set, if something feels off or something feels like wild to you, like there it is. And I think that really goes nicely with like this messaging too, of like, there's meaning behind the missingness. And so really kind of dig into that and see what's going on, knowing that there are some like real tools you can use, right? Like checking in on the standard deviation, checking in on the frequency, like just outliers, things that are clustered together. There's different ways to look at it, but have that consistency for yourself and your procedure. So, okay, each time I need to check the outliers. I need to check, see what's grouped together that feels clustery. And then what's something that, let me run the standard deviation to see how this is going, how this is coming up, to know, do I have something in my data set that is off, that is dirty data, if you will. So thank you. We probably have time for one more question. If anyone has any burning questions that they want to ask, we will share the recording from today, share out the presentation, and then we will have forthcoming a research brief that really brings all of this together as well. So you have this, but then also you can see like, how can I apply this back at my work and use this for our organization to improve our efforts with data and the work that you do every day in our community. So with that, thank you all so much for staying with us, for hearing. We have Coffee and Quality regularly. Our next one is actually next week. So if you were digging on this, like all this data talk and analyzing data, next week is about population and sample size data. Those are going to be really great topics to dig into, because you got a lot of data. How do you navigate that data? And that presentation is actually going to be done by Daniel Potter with Kinder Institute for Urban Research. So another second cup of coffee and quality, if you will, next week. You can scan the QR code to give us feedback on today. And again, thank you so much to Wesley Community Center, first for all the work that they do in the community, and then also for being a part of the case study so other organizations can learn from them, see what they're doing, and then also to continue to improve the work that y'all are doing. So thank you. And thank you to Kinder Institute for all of their work too on the case study. We're really grateful for your ongoing partnership. So all the thank yous, thank you. Please have a great rest of your day, and we will see you hopefully next week at the next Coffee and Quality.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.